Hello YouTube, and welcome back to my channel. I'm Duncan, and this is Some Old Elvis Guy. Today's video is entitled The Budget Elvis, the Camden story. And this is a curious part of Elvis's career in terms of his released records that I think is worthy of us just taking a few moments to look at, because it is quite an unusual direction for a record company to take with a current good-selling artist. In looking at the history of the Camden story, we need to go back to what many people consider, I certainly do, one of the pinnacles of Elvis's career, the NBC TV special, what we lovingly now call the '68 comeback special. With Elvis's movies not raking in what they once did at the box office, it became more challenging for Colonel Parker to negotiate the $1 million fee for Elvis doing a movie. So a deal was struck to make Change of Habit, the movie, along with the NBC TV special, for a little over $1 million. But part of that deal included the sponsorship of the NBC TV special by the Singer Sewing Machine Company. As part of that deal, Singer was given the rights to release a budget album of Elvis tracks exclusively for 3 months through their stores. What we ended up with was the album Elvis Sings Flaming Star. Now I've got here the RCA release. The original, I'll show you on the screen, had the word Singer Presents on the top of the album. And as I say, that was exclusive for 3 months, only to be sold through Singer. What's interesting about this, when you look at the track listing of this album, at the time, other than the title track, Flaming Star, if I turn this round, all the other tracks were unreleased tracks at that time. So although it was a budget album, it was doing, I suppose in a sense, what Legendary Performer Series and Follow That Dream label have since done. So I suppose there was some merit in the fact that there were unreleased tracks on this album. However, the majority of those tracks were unreleased tracks from movies. However, the album sold pretty well, and because it sold as well as it did, that led to RCA, after the 3-month exclusive period, releasing that album on their own label. With the Singer Presents Elvis being released in October of 1968, RCA released their own version of Elvis Sings Flaming Star in March of 1969, where it reached number 96. But what's interesting here is that had the Billboard chart in those days been based on unit sales rather than monetary sales, this budget album would have been really rather successful. In a sense, the success of the deal with Singer that created that first Elvis budget album was the catalyst that went on to encourage RCA to release more albums on this budget-created label. In April of 1970, RCA released Let's Be Friends, and that was spurred on by the success of the Flaming Star album. What's interesting though is that because the budget line of albums was not part of the mainstream RCA release schedule, the advance of $300,000 against royalties was to be split equally between Colonel Parker and Elvis Presley, because it lay outside the terms of their regular deal. This album was comprised of mainly unreleased movie songs. So again, fans were getting something special within a budget release. What's interesting is this charted at 105 on the Billboard chart in America as an album. But what's interesting is, when you look at the statistics, had this album at the time of release, being released to a chart that was clocking units sold, not monetary value, this budget album would have been a top 20 album. Now, as I said at the beginning of this video, it's a curious direction for a mainstream artist's releases to take. And what I'm not doing in this video is criticising Elvis or his recorded music. I more have some issues as to the motivation and the impact of creating this budget line of releases. Let's have a look at the next Camden release. I'm based in Scotland in the UK, and the Camden releases had different covers in different territories. And being from the UK, the majority of the Camden releases I have are UK covers. In October of 1970, RCA released their next Camden release, Almost in Love. Now this is one where the cover, for those of you watching from the United States, will not be the cover that you would recognise. In the UK, we have this cover, which uses a shot from the Guitar Man sequence in the '68 special on the front cover, whereas we have a concert photo of Elvis, as you can see here, on the US cover for Almost in Love, which is a cover that most of us know, to be fair. It's interesting when we think about these budget albums that way back in 1957, Colonel Parker wrote to RCA to explain, let me just read it here, that overexposure is like a sunburn, it hurts. And he said that with relevance to Elvis. Now, when we look at the rate at which these budget albums were released, alongside the new material Elvis was producing, it becomes clear that maybe Colonel Parker, being blinded by the money side of things, had somewhat changed his mind on what he'd written back then. Almost in Love as an album sold nearly as much as the previous two budget albums. And it's interesting, what we've essentially got at this point is almost like two separate record companies and almost like two separate artists. You've got budget Elvis and you've got mainstream artist Elvis, which I think is a little bit confusing. Now, if we look at the track listing of this one, again, there's some really good songs on it. And I do like some of these Camdens. I grew up listening to them. It's just worth having a wee look at how wise or otherwise it was for such a decision to be taken and the impact maybe it had. Did it cheapen the image of Elvis in any way? Our next Camden release is from November of 1970, and this is Elvis Sings Christmas Songs, the Elvis Christmas album. Now, I do have a wee soft spot for this album. Now, this is the original cover. This is actually the first album of Elvis's that I ever bought myself. Now, I bought the later release with a slightly different cover, with much more white on it, the cover that I'm showing on the screen just now. And I bought that for my mum's Christmas back in the early 80s. And I bought it from a store called Woolworth. Really big store in the UK for some time. In America, Woolworth existed, may still exist in the US. It ceased to trade as a store here some time ago. So I do like this album, but it's essentially an abridged re-release of Elvis's original Christmas album from the 1950s. Now, it charted, but it didn't do amazingly well. And what was interesting was Mama Liked the Roses was added to this album as well. So that was another one in 1970. So we're racking up releases really quite quickly. Our next Camden release was in March of 1971 and was You'll Never Walk Alone. Again, there's much to like on this album. But what's interesting now, having gone from starting the Camden story with Flaming Star, where one track had been previously released, the title track Flaming Star, we come to 1971 and You'll Never Walk Alone, where there is only one unreleased track on this album, and that is Let Us Pray, which was used at the end of Change of Habit. Of course, there was no soundtrack album for Change of Habit at that time. There's an FTD now covering Change of Habit and some other movies, but at that time they'd never been released. So we've gone from unreleased tracks to, in the case of this album, tracks going back to 1957 onwards, and only one unreleased track. So we move on only a few months further on in 1971 to Come On Everybody. Now again, this is another example of a different cover in the UK from the cover you get in the US. And again, this is a collection of movie songs, a compilation. Now, these songs had been previously available, but only previously available on EPs. Now, this only sold 100,000 copies at the time. However, if you think about it, these are all previously recorded songs. So from a monetary point of view, there were very little production costs. There was no recording sessions required, no studio time required, no producer time. And maybe that was part of the attraction, that after the success of the Flaming Star album, Parker and RCA saw a way to milk some more money out of Elvis. That's a theme we keep coming back to, isn't it? Of the people around Elvis looking for ways to make a fast buck out of him. So we go from July of 71 to October of 71 for our next Camden release, which is I Got Lucky. Again, on I Got Lucky, we have a compilation of movie songs. It's a wee bit bizarre to be having these albums released alongside new material, which is a little bit confusing, I think. But it's interesting when we look on at just how confusing it gets later on. This one reached 104 on the Billboard album chart at its time of release. So we go from October of 71 to June of 1972 for our next Camden release. Now, I don't have a physical copy of this one with a sleeve anymore to show you, but I'll put it on the screen. This was Elvis Sings Hits from His Movies. Now again, this one sold a respectful 130,000 copies, reaching 87 on the Billboard album chart. And I suppose the fact that these were selling was part of the motivation to keep going with it. But because there was less unreleased stuff, you have to ask the question, was it good value for fans, or were RCA and Colonel Parker relying on the good graces of fans, that fans would buy material by Elvis because they loved him so much, rather than because it was actually good value for them? Were the fans being exploited a little by RCA and Colonel Parker? Let me know what you think in the comments. So from June we go on to October of 1972, and I think this release, for thinking about the impact of Camden releases and budget Elvis releases, I think here's where it gets quite interesting. This one is called Burning Love and Hits from His Movies. Essentially, it's the volume 2 to the last album. This album was released at a time when Elvis had a gold record for both Elvis Has Recorded in Madison Square Garden and the Burning Love single. So in terms of a lead-in, you could be a lead-in to a blockbuster new album. So think about this. We have Burning Love high in the charts, and where do we decide as a record company to take the momentum of that Burning Love single and release it? Do we put it as part of a wider new collection, a new album? We don't. We decide to put it on this album, this budget album. Let me just show you the tracks. So we've got Burning Love, and then if you look down the list of the other tracks, it's movie songs previously released. So we have a situation where a new single gets its album release on a budget album with songs released years and years ago. I'm not sure what I think about that. I do wonder if it cheapens Elvis a little to do that. I do worry that Elvis was exploited, and I'm not sure I can think of another artist where a new hot single gets released on a budget compilation album amongst loads of old songs. And as well as that, not songs that were his greatest hits, to be quite honest. So I do question the motivation. I do question whether it was the best thing for Elvis's career, but they sold. And because they sold, they kept churning them out. Now, when talking about old songs being put together with current and new songs, brings us to our next album, which was released in December of '72, Separate Ways. So here we have the new song Separate Ways, which is a song I really like. It was a song, if you remember, that was featured heavily in Elvis on Tour. We see the recreated studio scenes of Elvis recording Separate Ways. So again, we have all this momentum from the Elvis on Tour movie promoting this song, and what album does it end up on? Separate Ways. And if we look at the track listing for Separate Ways, you have that new track, but you have songs going back as far as Old Shep. And again, I just wonder that it's not a waste and a demeaning of Elvis's talent to be putting a brand new song with that amount of promotion only released on a budget album like this. It's a message for a whole other video, the fact that we didn't get an album tied to the Elvis on Tour movie. We know the story of Standing Room Only and the album being cancelled. And we now have, thankfully, because of FTD, we have an FTD Standing Room Only album, which I love. It's an amazing album. And it shows us what might have been. I just wonder if these Camden releases don't speak more widely of almost a lack of care in the management and production of Elvis in his music career at this time. I just think it sort of smacks of almost a money grab, and we don't care what it says about our artist because it's Elvis and it'll sell anyway. This didn't sell quite as well as some of the others, but it still sold well enough. Now, I'm not against the fact that these budget albums exist. That's not what I'm saying. I think it was a cheap way for some fans to get into Elvis. I just question why, if it was right or not, to be releasing new singles on these albums and putting the albums full of movie songs. I can't help but think the motivation on Parker's part was maybe the fact that he was getting more money in royalties from those as a percentage than the newer albums, and they were really cheap to produce. The tracks were already there. Now, Camden has gone on since, certainly in the UK, to be transferred over to Pickwick, and a lot of the tracks have been reused on different albums and other ones have been released. A couple of examples that might be of interest is The King Elvis and Return to Sender. Again, it's largely a collection of movie songs in both cases. This one came with a poster, which when I bought it at the time, I had the poster, and it was on my bedroom wall as a teenager. Long since lost it. I really should have taken it. Nowadays, I wouldn't do that. I would have looked after it more, but in those days, you know, you put it on your wall. So I've long since lost the poster that went with it. So I wonder what you think. That's our delve into the Camden story. Budget Elvis. What's your thoughts on the Camden releases? As I say, I like to listen to them. There's nice stuff on there. And I'm not criticising that. And I'm certainly not criticising Elvis or his recording material. I just wonder, was it an exploitation? Did it cheapen Elvis a little? To be releasing new songs, not on a new album, but on an album full of, in some cases, more mediocre songs, certainly not the best of Elvis's back catalogue. And it just leaves a bit of a taste in the mouth with me as to whether, is it another example of exploitation of Elvis? Tell me what you think in the comments. Do you have a favourite Camden album? So see, I do like the Camden albums to listen to. If I was to choose a favourite, I'd probably go for You'll Never Walk Alone. But obviously I'm looking at this through the eyes of where we are now. So what was unreleased on albums like Flaming Star, these aren't unreleased tracks to me, so that doesn't factor into my thinking. I can imagine at the time there would be excitement over unreleased tracks being on the Flaming Star album, for example, and the early Camden releases. So let me know what you think is either your favourite Camden album, or if it's a Camden album that you think I really wish that I hadn't been released. Let me know, or let me know what you think about the whole strategy of budget releases on the Camden label. That's us come to the end of our Camden story for today. Thank you for joining me. And if you've liked this video, it would be amazing if you could click a like and subscribe to my channel and click the notification bell so that you get notified when I create new content. Thank you so much for joining me. Till next time, this has been Some Old Elvis Guy.